How far would you go into enemy country to bring back people you have never met? The Lady of the Golden Wood asks herself exactly that the night captives are driven east toward a tower of shadow, and her answer unsettles even those who serve her. Cross the river with her quietly. On the far bank, everything is listening. The warning came under the first stars, when the malon leaves had begun to pale against a deepening blue. Galadriel stood on a high flet above the western edge of Caras Galadon, one hand on the smooth white rail, and far below her the lamps of the city kindled among gold and silver boughs. No wind moved in the golden wood, yet she heard a disturbance beyond its borders, horses driven too hard, iron scraping stone, a cry cut short beneath the eastern trees. The sound did not reach her as mortal sound does. It touched the edge of her thought and left the shape of fear there. Haldir came swiftly along the woven bridge with 2 wardens behind him, their grey cloaks darkened by river water, mud on their boots. One of them carried a broken black-fletched arrow across both palms. They halted before her, but Galadriel had already turned east toward the unseen course of Anduin and the shadow rising past it. "Speak," she said. Her voice was low, and the leaves nearest her stirred as though a breath had passed among them. 3 homesteads beyond the eastern bank had been found empty before dusk, Haldir told her. Blood in the yards, though few bodies, and tracks leading south beneath the trees before they bent toward the old road under Amon Lank. He lifted the arrow from the warden's hands. "Orcs," he said, "and others with them. Men, perhaps, though their tread was strange." Galadriel took the shaft and turned it once between her fingers. The wood was coarse, stained with a dark resin that smelled of bitter roots and old smoke. A narrow mark had been cut along one side, scarcely deeper than a thorn scratch, a hooked tower beneath 3 bars. She knew it. It belonged to the servants who moved under the will of Dol Guldur, gatherers of captives and whispers, sent out beyond the stronghold's gates when concealment mattered more than slaughter. She asked how many had been taken. "Near 30, Haldir said. Woodmen, 2 children among them, and 4 of their own who had gone east to warn the settlements." The broken arrow snapped in Galadriel's hand. She did not look down at it. Beyond the circles of lamplit trees, the night pressed against Lorien like dark water against a bright shore. And in that darkness, many roads crossed one another. She closed her eyes and followed them. At first, there was only the cold gleam of the river beneath the moon. Then the eastern bank rose up in her thought. Willow roots, white stones, a path trampled through the reeds. The captives moved there in a bound line, driven by orcs in leather and mail, and hooded shapes kept to the rear. One prisoner stumbled. An old man lifted a child, his wrists bleeding beneath the cord. Above them, unseen in the branches, a crow watched with eyes too bright for any bird. The vision shifted. Black trunks crowded close, and the old road showed beneath fallen leaves. Where the road turned south, there stood a ruined house of stone, its roof broken, its court sunk under ivy, torches burning behind shuttered gaps. She saw an iron ring fixed in the floor and chains running from it, and a door marked with the same hooked tower. Past the ruin lay deeper shadow. A second company was coming north beneath the trees to meet the first, before dawn. Galadriel opened her eyes. "They have not yet reached the stronghold," she said. "They will halt at a ruined house east of the river, where the old road bends beneath the ash hills. Another band comes to take them south. If both companies join, the captives will pass beyond our reach before the next night." Haldir's face hardened. Then they would strike before dawn, he said, before moonset. Galadriel's answer came flat and quick. The second band would arrive earlier than its captain intended. He had sent a crow ahead, and the bird had already seen the eastern settlement standing empty. They must cross before it returned. She came down from the flet without haste, and the wardens followed. Word moved faster than her footsteps through Caras Galadon. Lamps were shaded. Bows came down from their pegs. Grey-cloaked figures stepped out between the trees and fell in silently behind her, chosen without summons by those who knew the signs of peril in the lady's face. Celeborn met her at the foot of the great stair, silver-haired beneath the boughs, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You have seen the road," he said at last. She had seen enough of it, she told him. "And the shadow upon it?" he asked. Galadriel looked east. It believed the river would guard its prey. Celeborn's gaze moved over the gathering company. 24 Galadrim stood beneath the trees with longbows, curved knives, and pale spears. No shield bore a device. No bright clasp caught the lamplight. Their horses waited further off, soft-footed and restless, their breath silvering in the cool air. He said she meant to lead them. She said yes. The answer passed between them like a drawn blade laid on a table. Celeborn's expression did not change, though his hand closed once on the hilt at his side. "Then take more," he said. "More feet will wake the eastern bank. More horses will slow the return." Galadriel stepped closer, and the light beneath the malorn branches lay clear on her face. "Hold the borders. If this is a feint, the blow will fall here, while we are beyond the river." He inclined his head and asked what she would do if the shadow closed behind her. "Then it will find that the Golden Wood has longer arms than it reckoned." At the northern edge of the city, she halted beside a narrow stream where the company waited in 2 ranks. Haldir stood at the fore, and with him Rúmil, Orofin, and Lindor, a warden whose eyes missed little even under cloud and leaf. 4 carried coils of rope, 2 small axes wrapped in cloth. Another held a bundle of the reed whistles used among the border guards, each one stopped with wax. Galadriel moved before them and named the road in a voice that carried no further than the waiting company. They would cross at the stone reach. Haldir would take 8 along the northern bank and silence the watchers. Rúmil would lead 6 through the hollow west of the ruin and cut the horse lines. Orofin would reach the southern road and bar the second company until the captives were free. Lindor would stay with her at the court. Her gaze passed over them, one by one. "No horn, no shout, no flame until I command it." A young archer named Kalana touched 2 fingers to his brow and asked what they should do if the prisoners could not walk. "They will walk while they can," Galadriel said. "When they cannot, we bear them." No one spoke after that. The Galadrim drew up their hoods, and the company flowed out from the city beneath the trees. Their way led east through Lórien, where the night stayed pale under the malorn leaves. Galadriel rode at the front on a white mare that carried neither bell nor ornament, guiding them along paths hidden by fern and silver grass. They passed sleeping talons, silent watchposts, glades where the stars showed between the high branches. No hoof rang on root or stone. Behind them, the lights of Caras Galadon faded until only a dim gold glimmer came through the wood. Nearer the borders the air changed. The sweetness of the malon groves thinned, and the smell of river mist came in among the trees. Galadriel raised a hand and the company slowed. Ahead, lay a low ridge where the outer wardens kept watch, and no greeting came from the shadows. Haldir slipped from his horse and vanished among the trunks. He came back a moment later, with an arrow already on the string. The post was empty. Galadriel dismounted. On the damp ground under a hazel bush, she found 3 marks pressed into the moss: a boot heel, a dragging knee, 1 drop of blood darkening at its edge. She knelt and touched the earth, and a brief chill moved through her fingers. "They came near," Lindor said. "They are still near," Galadriel answered. Above them, a branch gave the faintest creak. The Galadrim looked up as one. A black shape burst out of the hazel crown, wings beating hard toward the east. Lindor loosed before it cleared the leaves, but the crow twisted in the air, and the arrow passed beneath one wing. Kalina's shaft followed. It struck a branch and scattered pale bark. The bird gained the open dark beyond the ridge. Galadriel lifted her face, and the starlight sharpened in her eyes. The crow flew 3 wing beats, then faltered. Its body turned sideways as though it had struck an unseen wall. Feathers spun loose into the night. It dropped through the branches and fell at her feet without a cry. No hand had touched it. She looked down at the dead bird. A strip of thin leather had been tied around the leg, tucked beneath one black wing. Haldir cut it free and opened it on his palm. 3 small tokens: a chip of white bone, a thread of yellow cloth, a bead of green glass. "The captives have been counted," he said. Galadriel barely glanced at them. "Marked for division," she answered. "Bone for the stronghold, yellow for the pits, green for the servants of the tower." Kalina's jaw tightened at that, but she was already moving, telling them to leave the bird where it lay. They had lost no time yet. They rode on through the last trees of Lorien until the sound of Anduin filled the darkness ahead. The river lay broad beneath the stars, pale and swift, carrying threads of mist southward. On the farther bank, the land rose black and tangled. Beyond those unseen slopes, the shadow of Dol Guldur pressed against the night. At the stone reach, broken shelves of rock narrowed the water, though the crossing stayed deep. 2 hidden boats waited under willow branches, kept there by the wardens for need. The Galadrim brought them out without sound, laid wrapped oars across the thwarts, and led the horses down to the water's edge. Galadriel stood upon the last white stone of the western bank. The river wind lifted her hair and drew her cloak out behind her. For one breath she watched the darkness across Anduin. No torch, no moving shape, and felt watchers crouched among the reeds. She called Haldir to her side and pointed across the water. 3 upon the bank, she told him. 1 in the willow hollow, 2 farther south beneath the fallen oak. The 3rd carries a horn. He must not raise it. Haldir signaled to Rumil and Lindor, and the first boat slid into the current. Galadriel entered after them. The craft dipped beneath her weight, then steadied, its pale wood scarcely marking the dark water. Behind her the company began to cross in silence, horse by horse, boat by boat, while the golden wood stood bright and still beneath the stars. Ahead, the eastern shore waited under shadow, and the raid began. The first boat crossed beneath a drift of mist, its oars entering the river without splash. Galadriel sat at the prow with one hand resting on the gunwale. The current turned cold beneath the hull and drew them southward from the line they had chosen. Haldir leaned into the steering oar and corrected by a finger's breadth. Across the water, the eastern bank showed only as a deeper darkness beneath the stars. Within that darkness, Galadriel marked every waiting breath. A low branch trailed over the water near the far shore. The first watcher crouched beneath it, hidden in the reeds with a hooked blade laid across his knees. Another lay farther upslope behind a stone, bow bent, arrow resting against the string. The third had buried himself in the roots of a willow hollow, a horn hanging from his shoulder on a leather cord. Galadriel did not turn her head. "Take the archer first. The reeds will hide the other's fall." Lindor rose in the boat as lightly as mist off water. He loosed while the craft was still moving, and the arrow crossed the narrow dark without sound. Behind the stone, a shape folded backward. Rumil was already over the side, into water to his waist, catching the trailing branch and drawing himself up into the reeds. One brief stir, the scrape of a boot on wet earth. Then stillness came back. The boat touched gravel. Haldir sprang ashore and vanished toward the willow hollow, while Galadriel stepped from the prow into the shallows, river water flowing round her boots and catching the pale edge of her cloak. The watcher beneath the roots had heard something. His hand closed on the horn, and Haldir took him from behind and drove a knife beneath his mail before he could lift it. Another shadow moved farther south. Galadriel turned. A fourth watcher rose from the mud between two alder trunks. One the vision had not shown. He carried no horn. He held a small iron cage instead, and inside it a pale moth beat frantically against blackened wire. A spark glowed beneath the cage floor, waiting only for the latch. "Down!" Galadriel said. The Galadrim dropped into the reeds as the watcher flung the cage upward. Galadriel raised her hand, and the cage stopped in the air above him, hanging a heartbeat as though caught in clear ice. The watcher stared up at it. Then the spark died, the moth fell still, and the cage dropped back into his face. Haldir crossed the ground before the iron struck mud, and his blade ended the matter. He caught the cage by its chain and lowered it carefully. Galadriel came near and looked at the scorched marks cut into the wire. "A signal bred for the tower," she said. "Had the moth got free, it would have flown south." "The shadow has learned new ways," Lindor murmured, and she answered that it had always loved small servants. "Break the cage," she told them. "Drown the embers." The second boat reached the bank, the horses swimming behind on loose reins. The Galadrim came out of the river one by one and guided the animals into the willow cover, cloaks clinging dark to them, water running from bowstrings kept dry beneath waxed wrappings. Nobody spoke above a breath. The dead watchers were drawn beneath roots and reed mats, and the shore was left smooth, but for disturbed mud the river would soon reclaim. When half the company had crossed, the current quickened. A dark mass came drifting from the north, broad as a raft, turning slowly between the banks. Haldir lifted his bow. Galadriel caught his wrist. "Dead wood," he whispered. "Look again." The mass turned beneath the stars. Iron glimmered between the branches bound across it, and three low shapes lay hidden behind a screen of brush. A patrol had lashed trunks together and set itself adrift without oars, trusting the current to carry it silently to the crossing. One of the shapes raised its head and saw pale movement near the eastern bank. Galadriel stepped out of the willows into the open shallows. The river wind moved around her and lifted the silver hair from her shoulders. For a moment, the patrol on the raft could not tell whether it looked at a figure or a gleam upon the water. Then one reached for a bow. Galadriel's gaze met his across the dark current, and the hand on the bow froze. "Now," she said. 6 arrows flew from the reeds. 2 shapes fell at once. The third rolled behind the branch screen and cut loose a clay vessel sealed with pitch. It struck the water and broke, spilling a greasy fire that spread in a sudden red sheet across the current. The horses shied on the western bank. One tore free and reared and nearly overturned the waiting boat. Orifin caught its bridle, but the flare had already laid a bright road on the water, showing the crossing from bank to bank. Farther south, something answered with a faint metallic cry. Galadriel strode deeper in until the current pressed against her knees. She spread both hands over the burning water. The flames bent away from her, as reeds bend beneath wind, red tongues flattening, darkening, driven upstream in a narrowing line until they gathered round the drifting raft. The bound trunks caught at once. Fire ran through the branch screen and climbed the tarred ropes, trapping the last watcher behind rising flame. He tried to leap clear. Lindor's arrow struck him before he reached the edge. The raft turned once, bright on the black river, then swept southward with its dead. "Bring them across," Galadriel commanded. The boats moved faster now, oars dipping and rising in a measured rhythm while the last horses entered the river. The cry from the south did not come again, yet Galadriel felt its answer moving through the eastern trees. A patrol shifting course, 2 scouts leaving a path, a hound lifting its muzzle from the ground. The enemy did not know what had crossed. It knew only that the river had stirred. The final boat grounded beneath the willows. Kalanor leapt out first and drew the bowline round a root, while Orifin brought the last mare ashore. The company gathered in shadow, 24 warriors and Galadriel among them, every trace of the Golden Wood now hidden beyond the broad water. Across Anduin, the western bank lay pale and empty. Before them rose a land of black brush and broken slopes, and trees that leaned south as though the shadow had drawn them. Galadriel knelt and pressed 2 fingers to the damp earth. The patrol from the south had not yet reached the bank. Its hound had found blood where the watcher fell, but the river scent confused it, and there remained a narrow passage between discovery and alarm. She saw it closing like a door. "Haldir, take your 8 north along the bank," she said. "The patrol comes by the deer path. Let none return. Rumil, lead your 6 east through the thorn hollow and find the old road. Cut every tether at the ruin, but do not loose the horses until the strike begins. Orifin, go south now. The second company is nearer than we reckoned. Hold them beneath the ridge and give them no sight of our numbers." Orifin glanced toward the unseen road and asked how long they must hold. "Until you see white fire above the ash trees." He bowed once, then turned and vanished with his company into the dark. Haldir remained and wanted to know what she herself would do. Galadriel looked east through the trees, toward the captives waiting beyond miles of hostile ground. She could feel their weariness like a dim pulse beneath the shadow. 30 lives bound together by chain and fear, still moving because they had not yet been given leave to fall. She said she would take the center road. The ruin would be watched from above. They would enter beneath those eyes. She mounted, and the white mare moved forward without command. Lindor, Kalanor, and the remaining Galadrim followed in a narrow file. Behind them, Anduin rolled south beneath thinning mist, carrying the burning raft toward darkness. Ahead, the eastern land opened in silence, and every tree listened. The ground rose away from the river in long, uneven folds, where the roots of old trees gripped stone and rain had cut narrow channels through the dark soil. Galadriel led the white mare by the rein and chose the lower paths, where fallen leaves lay thick enough to swallow sound. Lindor moved ahead of her with 3 archers, passing from trunk to trunk beneath a roof of tangled branches. Kalanor came behind with the others, boughs unstrung beneath their cloaks until the damp air thinned. No one spoke while the river faded behind the hills. A faint light appeared between the trees to the south, low and red, then vanished. Galadriel halted beside a split beach and listened. That had not been a torch carried openly. It was the glow of a covered lantern, shown once and hidden, a signal passed between scouts who had heard the disturbance at the bank. She touched Lindor's shoulder and pointed toward a ridge veiled in thorn. 2 above them, she said, and a third waiting beyond the stone. Lindor studied the dark slope and said he saw no path. They made one this evening. He gave a quiet sign. Kalina took 2 archers left through the fern. Lindor went right beneath the ridge. Galadriel remained in the hollow with the others, her face lifted toward the branches. A nightjar called once from the western wood. Another answered too swiftly from the height above. The first scout came down the slope on hands and knees, using a strip of rope tied around an ash trunk. He wore a hood of grey hide and carried a short spear bound with strips of bone. Behind him followed a lean man in a dark coat, his beard braided close against his chin. The man paused halfway down and turned his head toward Galadriel's hiding place, as though some warning colder than sound had reached him. Galadriel stepped into the open. For a breath, the man stared, and the hard craft in his face gave way to wonder. Starlight rested on her hair and on the pale folds of her cloak, though no clear beam pierced the leaves above. The orc beside him bared its teeth and dragged up the spear. Galadriel lifted one hand, and the rope around the ash trunk broke. Both scouts fell. Lindor's arrow met the orc before it struck the ground, and Kalina caught the man's coat from behind, turned his fall, and drove him face first into the leaves without a cry. The third watcher sprang from behind the stone and ran east. Galadriel did not call after him. She reached toward the branch above his path, and the old wood bent with a deep groan until a heavy limb came down across the slope. The watcher tried to leap it, caught one foot, pitched forward. 2 Galadrim were on him before he could rise. Kalina rolled the captive onto his back. Another man, broad in the shoulder, with a black ring painted around one eye and a strip of iron sewn into his collar. His hand opened and closed beneath Lindor's blade. Galadriel asked how many were at the stone house. The man looked up at her and spat blood into the leaves. She knelt beside him. The company from the south, she told him, came sooner than he had been promised. His river watch was gone. His scouts would not answer. Speak now, and he might live to see another dawn. His eye shifted toward the ridge. Fear moved there, though he fought to hide it, and he told her she lied. Your captain carries a wolf skin over his left shoulder. He has 20 spears and 6 archers. One of his hounds limps from the forepaw, and the man leading it has wrapped the chain twice around his wrist. Her voice stayed quiet. He is less than a league from Orofin's bow. The captive's face emptied. He believed her then. 40 at the ruin, he said, more below the road, and the prisoners would leave when the moon touched the west hill. She asked how they were bound. 10 to a chain, he said. 2 chains in the court. 1 beneath the floor. Lindor glanced at Galadriel and counted it aloud. 30 above. How many below? The man swallowed. 7. Elves. Galadriel's gaze sharpened. 4 had been taken, she said. 3 before them, he answered. Weeks ago. For the first time since leaving Lorien, the stillness around her changed. It gathered close, bright and cold. The captive tried to turn his face away, but she held him with her eyes and asked who guarded the lower chamber. "A pale one," he said, "tall, wearing iron over his mouth," and the words came faster now. "He does not sleep. He hears through stone." Galadriel rose and told them to bind him beneath the roots and to leave him breath and water. Kalina hesitated, said the man had seen them. "He has seen only what fear will make larger." They drew the captive from the path and tied him deep beneath the fallen limb. Galadriel took the strip of iron from his collar and found on it the same hooked tower cut into the arrow shaft. Fresh scratches crossed the back, 3 lines, then 7. A count of captives, divided by kind. She closed her hand around the iron until its edge bent. The company moved east again, leaving the ridge behind, and their path narrowed into a cleft where wet stone rose on either side and brambles crossed overhead. The white mare could go no farther without breaking the silence, so Galadriel laid her brow against its face and whispered into one pale ear. The mare turned at once and withdrew westward, leading the other horses back toward a hollow where 2 Galadrim remained to guard them. On foot they entered the cleft. Water ran beneath the stones, carrying a smell of rust and dead leaves. At the far end, Lindor raised his fist. Ahead stood a row of black stakes set knee-high across the path, each joined by a cord no thicker than hair. Kalina bent close and asked if they were bells. "Worse," Galadriel said. She followed one cord with her eyes. It ran beneath leaves to a clay jar buried beside the path. Another led to a second jar, and from there through the roots toward a hollow log, and inside the log something shifted softly. Galadriel crouched and laid her palm on the ground. She felt the pulse of small wings, hundreds together, folded in darkness. Ash moths. Their bodies had been dusted with a powder that glowed when warmed by breath, and if the cord broke, the jars would crack, and a cloud of pale fire would rise above the trees. She told them to stand back. The Galadrim withdrew along the cleft. Galadriel took a narrow knife from Lindor and cut the first cord without touching it. The jar beneath the leaves trembled. She slipped the blade under the second line, lifted it free of the stake, and laid it gently on the soil. A third line, hidden lower than the others, tightened around her wrist. Kalina drew breath. Galadriel caught the cord between 2 fingers before it could pull. Beneath the hollow log, the moths began to stir, wings whispering against wood. She held the line steady and looked toward a dark notch in the stone wall. "There," she said. Lindor found the counterweight wedged behind the rock, a lump of iron balanced above a wooden peg. He slid an arrow beneath it and eased the weight down. The cord went slack in Galadriel's hand. One by one, the Galadrim passed through the stakes, setting their feet where she pointed. Beyond the trap, the land opened into thin woodland. Younger trees here, cut often, scarred by blades. Stumps stood among the bracken, and the old road showed through the leaves as 2 long depressions filled with rainwater. Far ahead, past a low rise, a dull orange glow trembled against the branches. They had come within sight of the ruin. Galadriel led them north of the road, beneath a line of ash where the ground fell toward a dry stream bed. Voices carried from the rise. Rough laughter, the clink of chain, a prisoner coughing until someone struck him quiet. The Galadrim spread without being told, each finding shadow and cover. From the stream bed, Galadriel saw the stone house for the first time. It had been a place of watch once, built by forgotten hands beside the eastward road. Half the roof had fallen. Ivy smothered one wall from earth to broken gable, and a square court lay before it, fenced with sharpened stakes. Inside that court, men and women sat chained in 2 lines beneath torchlight, heads bent, clothes torn by the road. Orcs held the outer wall and the gate. Men in dark coats watched from the roof. Near the rear stood a low stone building without windows, its iron door marked by a white hand smeared downward like ash in rain. Galadriel studied every movement. The prisoners could be reached 3 ways: through the gate, over the north wall, or beneath the fallen roof. Too many eyes on the gate. The wall had been trapped with hanging bones. The roof was watched by 2 archers and a man with a bronze horn. Beneath the court, 7 elves waited in darkness. Lindor lay beside her in the dry bed and murmured that Rumil should be near the horses. "He is there," she said. And when he asked after Haldir, she turned her face slightly west and listened past leaf and hill and distance, and a faint cry rose far behind them, cut short almost before it began. "The river patrol has found him. They will trouble us no more." A shutter opened in the ruined house. A tall figure stood within, lean beneath a long black coat, an iron plate covering the lower half of his face, with 2 narrow holes cut where his mouth should have been. He did not look toward the gate. He did not look toward the road. He looked north, directly at the stream bed. Galadriel lowered her head. The Pale One stood motionless behind the shutter, his gaze passing over the ash trees, the bracken, the broken line of stone above the dry watercourse. Then he lifted one gloved hand. Every torch in the court dimmed. The captives stirred. An orc at the gate peered into the dark beyond the stakes. The Pale One stepped out through the rear door and began to come down toward the stream bed, and Lindor's fingers closed around an arrow. "He hears through stone," he breathed. "He hears fear," Galadriel said. "Give him none." The figure came on, placing each foot with care. A chain hung from his belt, ending in 3 iron hooks. 2 orcs followed with round shields, heads turning side to side. Galadriel watched him descend until he stood within 20 paces of her hiding place. Then a horn sounded once from the southern wood. The Pale One turned. Galadriel rose from the stream bed, and the Galadrim rose with her. "Now," she said, their bows bent as one. The first arrows crossed the stream bed before the horn's note had died among the trees. One took the shield-bearer through the throat. Another drove beneath the arm of the second as he turned, and Lindor's shaft rang against the iron plate over the Pale One's mouth. He staggered, one hand rising to the dented metal. Galadriel came up the bank with her cloak flowing pale behind her. Torchlight lifted in the court above, and every face upon the ruined walls turned toward her. The Pale One tore the arrow free. Dark blood ran beneath the edge of his mask. He swung the hooked chain from his belt and cast it at her. But the links twisted in the air before they reached her, wound around his own wrist and jerked him sideways. He hit the ground hard. Callana crossed the distance at a run and drove his blade through the gap beneath the black coat. Galadriel did not watch him fall. "The roof," she said. 3 Galadrim loosed upward. The man beside the bronze horn dropped across the broken tiles and took the instrument down with him. One archer pitched backward through the open rafters. The other sprang behind the chimney stump and shot blindly toward the stream bed, and his arrow passed through Galadriel's cloak without touching her and buried itself in the earth. At the court gate, the orcs began to shout. Some rushed the northern wall. Others seized the chains of the captives and hauled them upright. A broad captain in a scale coat struck an old man across the face and shouted for torches to be thrown into the dry brush. Before any flame left a hand, a clear white light rose among the ash trees. It came from Galadriel. The light gathered around her without smoke or heat, bright enough to turn every branch black against the air. The orcs on the wall recoiled and covered their eyes. Men on the roof stumbled from the broken edge. For one breath, the whole ruin stood exposed. Gate, court, fallen roof, rear passage, and the low stone chamber beneath which the 7 elves lay bound. "North wall," Galadriel commanded. Kalanor and 4 others sprang from the stream bed and ran beneath the hanging bones. The traps clattered. Too late. 2 Galadrim cut the cords with upward strokes, and the bones fell harmlessly into the ivy. Lindor climbed first, found a hold in the broken stone, drew himself onto the wall as an orc came at him with an axe. He turned the blow with his bow, drove a knife beneath the creature's jaw, and pulled Kalanor up with his other hand. Inside the court, the captives crouched beneath the storm of arrows. A woman shielded 2 children under her body. One of the 4 captured Galadrim had risen, despite the chain at his ankles, and was trying to wrench a spear from a fallen guard. The scale-clad captain saw him and lifted a cleaver. Galadriel crossed the open ground between the ash trees and the wall. The captain's arm stopped above his head. His fingers opened. The cleaver fell beside his boot, and the captured elf drove the stolen spear through his chest. At the same moment, Lindor and Kalanor dropped into the court, blades flashing in the white light, and the northern guards broke around them. "Lady!" the captive elf called. "Hold your strength," Galadriel answered. "The chains first." She reached the wall and laid one hand on the stones. Ivy stirred beneath her palm. Thick green ropes uncoiled from the masonry and climbed through the cracks, widening them with slow force until a section of the old wall leaned inward. Galadriel stepped aside. It came down in a cloud of pale dust, opening a breach wide enough for 3 warriors abreast. The remaining Galadrim poured through. Across the rear of the court, a barred door opened, and 6 orcs rushed out with short bows. They loosed at close range. One shaft struck an elf in the shoulder and spun him against the fallen wall. Galadriel raised her arm, and the next flight veered upward as though caught by a gust, rattling across the roof, vanishing among the rafters. "Cut them free," she said. 2 Galadrim ran to the first chain, wrapped axes coming out, cloth falling away from bright steel. They struck the links where Galadriel pointed, and each blow landed on a floor hidden beneath the rust. The chain split after the second stroke. 10 captives stumbled apart, still joined in pairs at the wrist. At the western side of the court, the gate burst inward. Rumil rode through on a dark horse, bent low beneath the lintel, 3 riderless mounts thundering behind him, with loose reins streaming from their bridles. Beyond the gate, enemy horses scattered through the yard and into the trees, cut tethers whipping at their necks. Rumil leapt down before his horse had fully stopped and said the lines were broken. But riders were coming from the eastern road. "How many?" she asked. "Enough to close it." Galadriel looked once toward the shuttered house. The southern horn had sounded too soon, and the Pale Keeper had already turned the ruin from a prison into a snare. She felt Orofin's company holding among the ridges, arrows thinning, enemies pressing from 2 sides. West lay open only through the streambed. Beneath the court, 7 elves still waited behind stone and iron. She gave the orders without turning her head. Lindor to take the freed captives to the breach, Rumil to hold the gate until the second chain was broken, Kalanor with her. The low chamber stood at the rear of the court, behind a line of dead thorn bushes. Its iron door bore no handle, only a black ring sunk into the center, and the white mark smeared across the stone. Galadriel crossed to it, while arrows went over her, and steel rang on the gate. Kalina came after with 2 wardens, one carrying an axe darkened by broken chain. The black ring was cold beneath her hand. A murmur rose out of the stone, too low for speech, woven from many voices repeating the same command. Sleep. Yield. Forget the sun. The words pressed against thought and made the torchlight seem far off. One warden faltered and leaned on his axe. Galadriel's gaze hardened. "Open," she said. The murmur stopped. A crack ran across the white mark. The iron grew bright under her fingers, first red, then clear as silver under moonlight, and the door shook in its frame until the hinges tore from the stone and the whole slab fell outward into the court. A stair went down beneath it. Cold air came up from below, carrying wet earth, old iron, blood. Galadriel went first. White light followed her, clinging to the walls, showing narrow steps cut into black rock. At the bottom was a chamber, held up by 2 squat pillars, chains fixed between them, 7 figures lying on the floor. 4 wore the grey and green of Lorien. 3 wore garments faded by weeks beneath the earth. All were bound by iron collars, joined to a central ring. One of the older captives lifted his head as she entered, disbelief moving across his drawn face, and whispered, "My lady." She knelt beside him and asked whether he could stand. When the chain was gone, he said. Galadriel set both hands on the central ring. It had been driven deep into the stone and sealed with dark pitch. Small signs were cut around its rim in a hand learned from darker masters, and they crawled beneath her sight like insects disturbed by fire. Above, a great crash shook dust from the ceiling. Kalina looked toward the stair and said the one word, "The gate," and she told him to hold it. He ran up with 1 warden. The other stayed by the captives, hunting a place to set the axe. Galadriel closed her eyes and drew the white light down into the ring. The dark signs flared. For 1 heartbeat, the chamber went out of her sight. She saw instead a narrow road beneath Dol Guldur, a host moving north by hidden paths, and at its head, a rider beneath a hood whose face was no face. She saw Orofin's ridge overwhelmed, the streambed full of enemies, the river crossing taken before the captives reached it. Then the vision broke. Galadriel opened her eyes and pulled. The ring came free from the stone with a sound like a deep bell struck underground. Cracks ran outward across the floor. The collars opened one after another, iron springing apart beneath the sudden light, and she told them to get up. The 7 rose, some leaning on one another. Galadriel took the weakest by the arm and led them toward the stair. As they climbed, the noise above grew. Hooves in the yard, shields striking stone, Rumil calling the line back from the gate. They came out into a court full of dust and white fire. The second chain had been broken. Captives crowded through the breach under Lindor's guard, while arrows from the roof fell around them. Rumil and 6 Galadrim held the shattered gate against riders forcing their way between the posts. 1 horse had gone down in the entrance, and men in dark coats were climbing over it with spears. Galadriel stepped into the open. "Rumil, yield the gate," she called. "All west." He struck 1 spear aside, cut its bearer across the face, and turned. The Galadrim came away from the entrance in pairs, never showing their backs, loosing as they went. The riders surged after them. Galadriel raised the black iron ring she had torn from the floor. White fire ran around its rim. She cast it into the gate. The fallen horse, the broken timbers, the loose stones, all lifted together as though the earth had heaved beneath them. The entrance came down in a roar, burying the foremost riders, sealing the yard behind a wall of wreckage. Dust rolled across the court and swallowed the torchlight. "Through the breach," she said. The captives went first, guided down into the dry streambed. The wounded were lifted onto the freed horses. Children were passed from arm to arm. Galadriel stayed by the broken wall until the last of the 7 elves had crossed, then followed as enemy horns began to sound from every road around the ruin. Behind them, the white light faded. Ahead, the westward ground narrowed between stone and thorn, and pursuit woke beneath the trees. The streambed carried them west under leaning ash trees, its floor broken by stones and roots that caught at tired feet. Galadriel moved at the center of the rescued line, one hand on the bridle of a horse bearing 2 wounded elves, the other raised whenever the path divided. Ahead of her, Lindor led the strongest captives in pairs. Behind, Rumil and Kalanor held the rear with bows already bent. The ruin vanished among the trees, but its horns followed them, passing from ridge to ridge. Faster through the hollow, she told them. The ground opened beyond it. A child stumbled beside her, dragged down by the iron cuff still fastened round one wrist. Galadriel caught him before he hit the stones and lifted him onto the horse behind a wounded warden. The boy took hold of the elf's cloak and said nothing. His face was grey under the dirt. When she touched his brow, he raised his head and fixed his eyes on the west. The streambed narrowed until thorn branches met above it. Here the captives could pass only 2 abreast, and the line lengthened dangerously. Galadriel looked back through the press of bodies. The oldest prisoner had begun to limp. One of the women carried a broken chain wrapped round her forearm, its loose links striking stone at every step. "Bind the iron," Galadriel ordered. Kalanor tore a strip from a dead guard's cloak and wrapped the chain tight. Behind him, Rumil stopped under a low branch and loosed twice into the darkness. A cry answered from the rise. Then another arrow came from behind and struck sparks off the stone beside his boot. "They had the upper ground," he said. "They will lose it at the fork." The streambed divided round a spine of black rock, one branch climbing north through loose scree, the other bending south beneath a roof of elder and yew. Galadriel did not pause. She sent Lindor and the captives into the southern branch, then took 6 Galadrim up the northern slope. Rumil glanced after the fleeing line and said they were dividing their strength. "We divide their sight." They climbed fast, using roots and broken stone for holds. At the crest, Galadriel found the place she had seen only in a brief flash before the raid. A shelf of earth hanging above the northern fork, held by old roots half rotten under the moss. She pointed to 3 narrow cuts between the stones and told them axes there, no deeper than a hand. The Galadrim worked without question. Wrapped steel bit into earth and root, while arrows hissed through the branches below. Kalanor leaned over the edge and saw shapes entering the streambed, dark coats and round shields pressing forward under torchlight. They were close, he said. "Let them come under us." The pursuers reached the fork and split. Half took the northern path, where footprints had been left plainly among the stones. The others hesitated at the southern branch, searching the ground beneath the yews. Galadriel waited until the first shield-bearers had passed below the shelf. "Now." The axes struck once more. Roots gave way with a tearing sound. The whole face of the slope slid down in a rush of soil, stone, and broken timber. Men shouted beneath it. Torches went out. The northern fork filled from wall to wall, burying the foremost pursuers and sealing the rest behind a mound of earth. Before the dust had settled, Galadriel led the six down the far side of the ridge. They crossed a strip of bracken and found the captives again, where the southern branch opened out beneath thin trees. Lindor had brought them through without loss. One horse bled from a cut along its flank. They would climb over the fall, he said, and she agreed. By then they would be angry, and anger shortens the sight. A whistle came from the south, one note falling, then rising. Every Galadrim stopped where he stood. Orofin's signal. Galadriel turned toward it. Through the trees, she felt his company moving north under pressure, 6 bows answering many, the ridge behind them already gone. The second enemy band had broken around their southern hold instead of through it, and now they were coming across the retreating line. She told Lindor to take the captives toward the alder marsh, to keep to the dry roots and wait beneath the white bank. He looked south and said she meant to meet Orofin. I mean to open his road. She chose 8 and left the rest with Lindor. Rumil came to her side before she named him. They ran south through a wood scarred by fire, blackened trunks standing among new green, and the ground dipped sharply, and the smell of horse and iron came through the leaves. Below lay a broad ravine, cut by winter water. Orofin and 4 Galadrim held the eastern lip, shooting from behind fallen trunks, while men and orcs pressed up the slope. 2 of his company were missing. One more knelt with blood on his leg, still loosing from the ground. On the western side, another force had begun to descend toward the captive's path. Galadriel saw the danger whole. Aid Orofin alone, and the western force would reach Lindor. Turn west, and Orofin would be swallowed before he could withdraw. Between the 2 lines, a long dead pine leaned out over the ravine, its roots torn half from the bank. She told Rumil to take 4 below the pine and cross beneath it when it fell. He followed her gaze and understood, and asked about the western line. Galadriel drew the small knife from her belt. Mine. She stepped out of the burned wood into open ground. They saw her at once. Their captain reined in on the ridge, a man broad beneath a wolfskin mantle, exactly as she had foreseen beside the captive scout. The limping hound strained beside him, its chain wrapped twice about its keeper's wrist. The captain raised his spear and called for her to be taken living, and his riders came down. Galadriel walked toward them. Dry grass bent outward from her feet. Ash lifted off the blackened trunks and turned in pale circles around her. The hound stopped first, dug all 4 paws into the earth and began to whine, dragging its keeper backward. The captain drove his heels into his horse. Galadriel raised the knife. A clear line of light ran along its edge, though the blade was no longer than her hand. The captain's horse swerved from that brightness and struck the rider beside him. 2 more mounts reared. The slope became hooves and shouting. "Loose," she said. The Galadrim rose out of the burned wood behind her. Their arrows went over her shoulders and found the riders while they fought for command. The wolfskin captain took one through the upper arm and nearly fell. Another struck the hound's keeper and broke his grip on the chain, and the beast fled uphill. Across the ravine, Orofin saw the opening. He called his line back by pairs, one shooting while another withdrew, and the enemy pressed after them. Galadriel turned the shining knife toward the dead pine. Its roots split. The tree fell slowly at first, branches dragging through the air. Then its own weight carried it across the ravine with a deep crack, and the crown smashed into the eastern lip among the advancing orcs. Orofin and his remaining Galadrim ran beneath the falling trunk, crossed on stone and root, and climbed toward Rumil's waiting hands. The last wounded warden could not rise quickly enough. Orifin turned back. Galadriel saw the choice before he made it. "Leave no one," she called. He went down again, lifted the wounded elf across his shoulders, and climbed while arrows struck the pine around him. Rumil leaned from the bank and caught the wounded man's arm. They dragged him clear as the enemy reached the trunk. The Western riders had recovered by then. Their captain pulled the arrow from his arm, cast it aside, and shouted for the lower path around them. Galadriel looked north. Lindor and the captives had already vanished toward the marsh, and the lower path would put riders at the White Bank before the rescued line could cross. She lowered the knife. Wind moved through the burned trees. It came first as a cold breath out of the west, carrying the scent of Anduin and the far leaves of Lorien. Then it gathered among the black trunks and rushed downslope. Ash rose in a blinding wall. Horses screamed and turned their heads, and men covered their mouths and lost sight of one another. "North!" Galadriel commanded. The Galadrim withdrew through the grey storm. Orifin came up beside her, breathing hard, the wounded elf carried between two wardens. 2 fell at the ridge, he said, and she said she knew. He told her the Southern Company still had many spears. Fewer than it carried across the hills, she said. They ran north until the ash thinned behind them. Ahead, the land sank into alder marsh, dark pools between raised roots, white mist lying close to the ground. Lindor waited beneath a pale bank of clay, with the captives gathered in its shelter. One look at Galadriel's face, and he had them moving again. There was a causeway beneath the water, she told them. 3 stones wide at first, then 1. Step only where I step. She entered the marsh. The first pool came no higher than her ankles, but black mud opened on either side of it, deep enough to swallow horse and rider. Galadriel crossed on hidden stones, veiled under brown water, and behind her, the captives came in single file, hands on shoulders, the wounded borne between the Galadrim. Pursuit burst from the trees as the last of them reached the middle. The wolfskin captain came through the drifting ash, mounted again, leading riders along the lower path. He saw the line crossing the water and drove forward without waiting for scouts. Galadriel stopped on the narrowest stone and told Lindor to keep moving. The captives passed her one by one. The riders entered the marsh. The first horse found solid footing and followed the visible ripple the fugitives had left. The second stepped half a pace aside. Mud opened under it, and horse and rider went down to the chest, and the line behind crowded forward, unable to turn. The captain raised his spear and hurled it. Galadriel lifted her hand. The weapon changed course by the width of a leaf, passed beside her, and struck deep into the white bank beyond. She met his eyes across the dark water. Then she stepped off the hidden causeway onto the western shore. The last Galadrim followed. Behind them, the marsh water stilled over the stones, and the path beneath it was gone. Beyond the marsh, the land climbed through alder roots into a country of low ridges and scattered stone. The rescued line came up out of the mist without speaking, clothes dark with water, breath whitening in the colder air. Galadriel moved among them as they climbed, steadying one, lifting another, setting the pace with a glance whenever weariness threatened their order. Behind, the marsh held the riders a little while. Already axes were striking wood where they sought to lay branches across the mud. Lindor said the river lay west. 3 leagues, she answered, 2 before the ground turned open. The old man who had carried the child on the captive road faltered beside a standing stone. His wrists were raw under the broken cuffs, and one leg shook whenever he put weight on it. Galadriel took the child from the horse, set him on another mount behind Kalanor, and gave the old man her own place at the bridle. "He must keep the horse moving," she said. He looked at her with hollow eyes. "Lady, I cannot ride. You need only hold." He gathered the mane in both hands. Galadriel walked at his side until his breathing steadied, then went back to the head of the line. Thorn and pale grass crowned the ridge ahead. No tree stood on it, and the moonlight lay broad across the slope. To cross openly would give every pursuer a clear mark. Galadriel halted below the crest and looked north, where broken ground wound between two steep shoulders of stone. "That way adds distance," Rumil said. "It adds cover," she replied. "Take the wounded through the cut. Haldir should meet us beyond it." Orifin watched the eastern dark and said only, "Should." Galadriel turned to him. His face was calm. Blood had dried along one sleeve where an arrow had grazed him. "He lives," she said, "but the river patrol has driven him north. We shall make the meeting place come to us." They entered the cut, where the path narrowed between high walls of grey stone. Rain had carved ledges along either side, and thorn roots hung down like old cords. The horses went single file. The captives pressed close beneath the cliffs, hearing pursuit behind them, without seeing it. Halfway through, Lindor stopped. A stone lay in the path with fresh earth beneath it. Galadriel knelt before the mark, 3 grooves drawn with the point of a knife, then crossed by one long line. Haldir's sign, enemy ahead, road watched, pass beneath. She looked up. The southern wall rose sheer for 20 feet, then broke into a shelf hidden beneath bramble, and on that shelf 5 dark figures lay motionless, with bows pointed into the cut. Farther on, another waited beside a pile of loose stone, ready to be cast down upon the horses. "Do not look above," Galadriel said softly. "Walk." The line moved forward. She kept one hand upon the stone wall as she went, and cold travelled through it, carrying the faint pressure of boots on the shelf, the scrape of bow wood against rock, the quickening pulse of men waiting for the perfect distance. The first hidden archer drew. Galadriel closed her fingers. A crack ran through the shelf beneath him. The stone did not fall. It shifted only enough to break his aim, and his arrow struck the opposite wall and snapped. Before the watchers could loose together, Haldir rose behind them from the bramble. His first blade took the nearest man beneath the shoulder. 2 Galadrim appeared with him, silent and sudden upon the shelf, shooting downward at arm's length. The watcher beside the loose stones turned, but Galadriel pointed once, and the root around his ankle tightened. He fell backward from the ledge. "Forward," she called. The captives hurried through as the fight passed above them, in flashes of steel and falling dust. One body struck the path behind the last horse, and Kalanor pulled it aside without slowing. At the far end of the cut, Haldir leapt from the shelf and landed beside Galadriel with a word of greeting. "Lady!" And she told him he had been driven north. 7 followed us from the bank. 3 more came from the old road. He looked over the rescued line. "We ended them, though we lost one." Galadriel held his gaze for a breath. "Name him when we cross." Haldir bowed his head once and fell into step. The cut opened beneath a stand of bare oak. Beyond it lay a wide field of heather rolling toward the west, silver beneath the moon, and in the far distance a pale line of mist marked Anduin. Between the field and the river stood one last belt of woodland, dark and low. The captives saw the mist and lifted their heads. A murmur passed through them. no louder than leaves touching. Galadriel turned before hope could become haste and told them to stay close, that the open ground was watched. Haldir studied the heather and said he saw no fire. "They have hidden it." She walked to the edge of the field and raised one hand. Wind moved over the heather, flattening it in long waves. For a moment, nothing showed. Then small red points glimmered where coals had been buried beneath pierced iron bowls, a line of them crossing the field from north to south, spaced a bowshot apart. Lindor's expression tightened. "Signals." "And snares," Galadriel said. Thin cords ran between the bowls beneath the heather. Break one, and the buried coals would flare. The whole field would burn in lines, hemming the fugitives inside a cage of fire while archers shot from the western wood. Rumil looked back and said the marsh riders would reach the cut soon. They would find it blocked, she told him. No one had seen Galadriel give an order, yet behind them a deep grinding sound rolled between the cliffs. Stone shifted where the hidden shelf had cracked. The narrow way collapsed in a thunder of rock, sealing the passage from wall to wall, and dust rose among the oaks. "We have one road now," Galadriel said. She stepped into the heather. The first cord lay hidden beneath her boot. She bent, lifted it gently, and traced its path to the buried bowl, while Kalanor and Haldir watched her hands. One by one she revealed the lines, naming safe ground with small motions of her fingers, and told the captives to place their feet in hers and touch no red flower. The heather bore tiny rust-colored blooms among the silver stems. Beneath each flower, a peg held one signal cord taut. The path between them curved and narrowed, forcing the company into a thin line across the open field. They had reached the middle when an arrow came from the western trees. It struck a horse high in the neck. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the old man sideways. The child behind Kalenna cried out. A second arrow followed, then a third, black shapes cutting through moonlight. "Down!" Haldir ordered. The Galadrim formed around the captives, cloaks spread low, boughs bending toward the wood. The wounded horse plunged into the heather, one hoof catching a hidden cord. Red fire sprang from the earth. It ran north and south in two bright lines, racing through the buried channels. Iron bowls burst open beneath the heat. Flames climbed the heather and curved around the company, and the western archers began to shoot in earnest. Galadriel stood within the rising fire. Smoke streamed across her face, but the flames nearest her bent low and parted. She turned toward the hidden bowmen. Through branch and darkness she saw their line. 12 men beneath the trees, 3 orcs among them, and behind all a tall rider with a horn, bound in black cloth. "Haldir," she said. 9 paces left, loose high." He did not ask what lay there. The Galadrim shifted and sent one flight above the first rank of trees. Cries answered from the wood. 2 archers fell from a raised bank they had believed hidden. Galadriel lifted both arms. The wind changed. Flame that had raced westward stopped and drew itself upright, then leaned toward the trees. The fire crossed the field in a bright wall, devouring the signal lines, burning through the archers' cover, forcing them from shadow into open ground. "Now," Galadriel said. The Galadrim shot. Men fell among the heather. The horn-bearer dragged the black cloth free and raised the instrument, but Lindor's arrow struck his wrist and Kalanor's followed beneath the ribs. The horn dropped into the fire and gave one broken note as the hide around it burned. The old man crawled from beside the fallen horse. Galadriel reached him first, lifted him beneath the arm, and placed him upon another mount. The wounded animal lay still now, its blood dark among the silver stems. "Open the western line," she commanded. Rumil and Orofin led the strongest Galadrim through the parted flame. They crossed the last stretch at a run, shooting into the disordered archers as they went. Haldir stayed with Galadriel until the captives began moving again. The fire curved around them like two bright wings. They passed through the field beneath a sky paling toward dawn. Behind them, the eastern riders came out of the oak, cut only to find the collapsed pass and the heather burning beyond it. Ahead, the western wood opened, and through its trunks came the cold breath of Anduin. Galadriel entered beneath the trees with the rescued line around her. Then from the riverbank, 3 horns answered one another. They sounded from different reaches of the river, one north, one south, one directly ahead. Their notes passed through the western wood and struck one another beneath the branches. The captives halted, as though a wall had risen before them. Galadriel did not slow. She moved to the front of the line, white fire from the burning field still glimmering behind her through the trees. Haldir said the crossing was held. "It is watched," Galadriel answered. "That is not the same thing." The wood fell sharply toward Anduin. Oak and alder gave way to willow, and the ground became soft beneath layers of old leaves. Through the trunks the river showed in pale strips beneath the whitening eastern sky. Shapes moved along the near bank, shields among reeds, spearheads behind fallen logs, archers climbing low mounds of gravel. The enemy had reached the river before them. Galadriel knelt beside a shallow pool that had gathered between the roots. Its surface trembled with each distant footfall. She laid 2 fingers on it and saw broken glimpses. The stone reach held by men in dark coats, the hidden boats hauled out from the willows, one split by an axe, the other tied beneath guard. Farther north, a narrow shelf of gravel ran into the stream, where the current divided around an island of reeds. Southward, the bank sank into deep mud under a steep rise. Lindor came and crouched beside her and asked after the boats, and she told him one remained. He said they would take it. She said the enemy expected exactly that. The horns sounded again, the central note first this time, and the northern and southern calls answered in turn, closing the river road between them. Galadriel rose and looked among the captives. Weariness had hollowed their faces, yet none had fallen. The children sat between wounded elves upon the horses, watching the pale water through the trees. She named Orofin, and told him to take 6 south and show himself upon the ridge, and to let them believe the wounded went with him. He glanced toward the darker ground beneath the rise, and said there was no crossing there. There need not be. Orofin chose his 6 and took 2 riderless horses. They broke branches, dragged cloaks through the leaves, and turned south with noise enough for any waiting scout. Galadriel watched until the last grey shape was gone among the trunks. Haldir she sent north with the captives toward the gravel shelf. He said the northern horn would close on them. It would turn south, she answered, once Orofin was seen. He understood and asked about the central watch. Galadriel looked toward the stone reach. It will look at me. She chose Rumil, Lindor, Kalanor, and 5 others. The remaining Galadrim formed around the rescued line and began to move north through the willows. Galadriel waited until they had gone beyond sight, then went down toward the central bank. Mist lay thick over the water. It coiled among the reed beds and drifted across the stones where the first boats had landed hours before. Stakes had been driven into the mud now, black shields standing between them, men crouched behind with arrows laid ready. Orcs held the rear beneath the trees. The unbroken boat floated below the bank on 2 ropes. A captain stood above it in a bronze helm. He had put the horn-bearer behind a fallen willow and 3 archers up in the branches overhead. More waited along the eastern bank, bows turned toward any attempt from the water. They had made the crossing a narrow mouth of steel. Galadriel stepped from the trees alone. The captain saw her and raised one hand, and every bow bent. He called out that she had come far for what was already lost. She walked down the slope until the mist touched the hem of her cloak and told him to release the boat. He laughed once, though nothing of it reached his face, and said she should come and take it. "I shall." He dropped his hand. The arrows flew. Galadriel lifted her gaze. Wind struck the bank off the river, sudden and clean. The first flight turned in the air, shafts colliding above her and falling among the reeds. 2 passed close enough to stir her hair. Neither touched her. The Galadrim rose behind the trees. Rúmil and Kalanor shot upward, and 1 branch archer came down through the willow crown. Lindor's arrow took the horn-bearer before he could sound warning, and the bank erupted in cries as the hidden company loosed from 3 places at once. Galadriel walked down through it. A man rushed from behind the shields with a spear. She turned her hand, and the point went into the mud beside her foot. Rúmil's blade took him across the neck. Another came from the reeds, but his shield twisted against a stake and held him there long enough for Kalanor to reach him. The bronze captain drew a long sword and shouted for the boat to be closed off. 2 orcs hacked at the ropes. Galadriel looked toward the water. The knots tightened around the willow roots, then came free as though cut by an edge no one could see. The current caught the boat and swung it out from the bank before the axes could fall. She asked for rope. Lindor cast a coil, and she caught it, looped one end about her forearm and stepped into the river. Water rose to her knees, then her waist. The boat drifted on, drawn toward midstream. Rúmil was fighting at the bank behind her. He shouted for her. Galadriel pulled. The rope straightened across the water, and the boat stopped. For a moment, river and will held against one another. Then the craft began to turn, and inch by inch it came toward her, its pale side rising through the mist. She drew it into the shallows, handed the rope to Lindor, and told him to take it north. The bronze captain broke out of the fight and came down the bank, blood on one side of his helm, his sword red to the hilt. Galadriel faced him, while the Galadrim dragged the boat in among the reeds. He told her she would not cross. She looked past him. Through the trees to the south, Orofin's riders had appeared upon the ridge. Men along the bank shouted and turned. The southern horn sounded twice in alarm, and half the central reserve began to run toward the false retreat. The captain heard it, and understood too late. Galadriel drew her knife. He struck hard for her shoulder. She stepped inside the sweep and turned the blade aside with that small, bright edge, and steel rang beneath the willows. His second cut came low. She caught his wrist, and his arm stopped, as though seized in iron. "You have mistaken where the road lies," Galadriel said. She released him. Rúmil's spear went in beneath the rim of the bronze helm, and the captain fell backward into the reeds. "Withdraw," Galadriel commanded. The Galadrim broke from the bank in order, 2 shooting while the rest pulled the boat north under willow cover. Kalanor came last. An arrow struck him below the shoulder and drove through his cloak, and he stumbled. Galadriel reached him before he fell, snapped the shaft near the wound, and drew his arm across her shoulders. He said through his teeth that he could walk. "Then walk quickly." They climbed from the bank as fresh horns went up behind them. The central watch had seen the boat moving north, and orcs and men poured out of the stone reach, following through the trees. Ahead, the wood thinned around a strip of pale gravel. Haldir waited there with the rescued line gathered beneath a low bank. The river divided around a long island of reeds, narrowing the western channel until the current ran swift and smooth between two shelves of stone. No boat could carry all the captives before pursuit reached them. Haldir saw Kalina's wound, then asked about the crossing. "Here," she said. He looked at the narrow water and said the horses might swim and the children might ride, but the wounded would not all survive the current. Galadriel went to the edge. The river was deeper than it looked. Beneath the smooth surface, Anduin ran hard over slanted rock, gathering strength toward the southern channel. She could feel the weight of it pressing westward, cold and old, carrying mountain water under the first light of dawn. Behind them, branches broke. Pursuit was close. Galadriel looked upon the reed island. Its eastern edge was bound by roots and silt. The western side had been cut away by flood, leaving a submerged ridge of stone beneath the channel. The path was there. The water covered it by more than a man's height. She told them to bring the horses forward. Lindor stared at the river and said her name like a question. "Bring them." The mounts were led onto the gravel shelf. Galadriel set the children upon the strongest, then put wounded captives behind Galadrim, who could guide them. The rest of the prisoners joined hands in two lines, each tied to a long rope held by Haldir and Rumil. The stolen boat came last. It could carry 6 wounded at most. Galadriel stepped into the river. Cold water rose around her. She moved out until it reached her chest, then lifted both hands toward the current. The air brightened, a pale gleam ran beneath the water, tracing the hidden ridge from the gravel shelf to the reed island. Anduin pressed against her. Her cloak streamed southward, and her silver hair lifted on the wind. The current struck harder, climbing toward her shoulders, and still the pale line beneath the water grew clearer. "Now," she said. The first horse entered. Its hooves found stone. Haldir led the first rope line after it, and the captives stepped into the river one by one, water rising to their waists, then their chests. They kept their feet where the pale light showed beneath the surface. The boat moved beside them, guided by Lindor and 2 Galadrim. An arrow fell into the river, then another. The pursuers reached the trees. Rumil turned with 6 archers and formed a line on the gravel shelf. Their bows sang, and men dropped among the willows. Shields came forward, locking between the trunks. "Hold 3 flights!" Galadriel called, and Rumil loosed the first. The captives crossed toward the reed island with the water dragging at their legs. One woman slipped and vanished to the shoulders. Haldir hauled the rope tight. 2 others pulled her upright, and the children clung to wet manes while the horses swam above the submerged path. The second enemy flight came lower. A rescued elf cried out and lost his grip, an arrow through his upper arm. Galadriel caught the rope before it slid from his hand and drew him back into line, telling him to keep his eyes west. On the gravel shelf, Rumil gave the second flight. The enemy shields advanced. Kalina was pale from blood loss. He knelt beside the archers and loosed with one arm held close, and his arrow passed through a gap between 2 shields. A man fell. The line closed over him. The last captives reached the reed island. "Rumil!" Galadriel called. He gave the 3rd flight and withdrew. The Galadrim came backward into the river, shooting from the shallows until arrows struck the water around their knees. One fell, rose again and was caught by Haldir at the island's edge. Galadriel stayed between them and the eastern bank. The captain who replaced the fallen man drove the shield line onto the gravel and shouted at them to take her. Galadriel turned toward him. The pale path beneath the water vanished. The current surged back across the hidden ridge, and men who had begun to follow stepped into sudden depth. Their shield wall broke. Two were swept south at once, dragging others after them. Galadriel reached the reed island as arrows hissed overhead. The company gathered there only for a breath. The western channel still lay between them and Lorien, narrower than the first, but swift beneath the growing dawn. Across the water, horns answered from the western bank, and Haldir looked up. Grey-cloaked figures rose among the trees of Lorien, bows shining pale beneath the leaves. The golden wood had seen them. The first arrows from Lorien crossed the western channel in a pale storm. They passed above Galadriel and struck the eastern bank where the broken shield line struggled in the current. Men fell backward among the reeds, orcs dropped beneath willow roots, and those who had reached the shallows cast themselves flat as the Galadrim of the Golden Wood took the measure of the river. A clear call sounded from the western trees. Haldir answered with the cry of the northern wardens, and the boughs beyond Anduin shifted at once, their next flight falling farther south, striking the pursuers who sought to move along the eastern bank and find another crossing. No horn had been needed. The two companies read one another across the water, as though no river lay between them. Galadriel stood on the reed island with the rescued folk gathered around her. The island was little more than a long bed of silt bound by roots, narrow enough that the company could not remain there under fire. The western channel ran deep beside it, dark beneath the dawn, and the single boat rocked against the reeds with 6 wounded captives lying low inside. She asked who commanded the western bank, and a warden peering through the reeds gave her the name Egnor of the Southern Marches. Galadriel lifted one hand. Across the channel, a tall elf stepped from the trees, a silver clasp showing briefly at his shoulder before he covered it beneath his cloak. She pointed north along the bank, then drew her hand southward and closed her fist. Egnor bowed, and his wardens vanished among the trees. Haldir watched them go. He leaves the crossing. He prepares another. Behind the company, the eastern bank had become a place of smoke and shouting. The surviving enemy archers crawled into cover and began to shoot from beneath the willows. Their shafts struck the reed island in quick succession, cutting stalks, rattling against stones beneath the roots. One pierced the side of the boat and stood quivering above the waterline. Lindor broke it off and said the craft would hold. "For one passage," Galadriel said. The western channel was too broad for the boat to return before the eastern archers found its measure. Horses might swim it, yet the current bent south toward a line of hidden rocks. The unwounded Galadrim could cross, though not while guarding the rescued folk and holding the island. Galadriel looked north. The river widened there around a gravel bar that showed faintly beneath the water, and beyond it, the western bank curved eastward, shortening the channel. The path was longer by land, the crossing narrower. Egnor's wardens were already moving to secure it. "Take the island north," she said. "Keep beneath the eastern reeds." Rumil glanced at the captives and said the roots would not bear the horses. They would bear them long enough, she told him. The company began to move along the narrow island. Galadrim went first, testing every patch of silt with spear butts, and behind them came the prisoners in single file, leaning upon one another. The horses followed with lowered heads, hooves sinking deep among the roots. The wounded in the boat were drawn through the reeds by 2 ropes, the craft sliding parallel to the shore. Galadriel stayed near the rear. The enemy saw the movement and shifted north along the eastern bank. Men ran between the trees with shields overhead. Orcs moved lower through the reeds, using the river mist to cover their approach, and their new captain, a narrow-faced man in black mail, drove them forward with a hooked sword. "Cut them off at the island's head," he shouted. "The river will hold the rest." Galadriel heard him clearly. She turned to Kalana, whose wounded shoulder had been bound tightly beneath his cloak. His face had lost much of its color. The bow was still in his hand. She asked whether he could loose once more. "As often as my fingers obey." "Then take the man with the hooked sword." Kalana knelt among the reeds. The enemy captain appeared and vanished between the eastern willows, guarded by 2 shields, and Kalana followed the movement without drawing. He waited until the man reached a patch of open gravel and lifted his blade to signal the advance. The arrow crossed the water. It struck the captain beneath the collarbone and turned him half around. He fell against one shield-bearer, dragging both into the shallows. Confusion ran through the pursuers. Galadriel said it was good. Kalanor lowered the bow and offered one more, perhaps. She told him to keep it. The island narrowed ahead to a strip of mud, no wider than a fallen tree. Lindor led the first captives across with both arms outstretched. One horse sank to the knee, recovered, then tore free a mass of roots behind it, and water poured through the gap. The island began to break. "Move!" Haldir called. The rescued line hurried forward. Roots cracked beneath their feet. Sections of silt slid into the channel, carrying reeds and stones away in the current, and the boat swung hard against its rope and nearly overturned. Galadriel caught the stern. For a moment, the river pulled the craft sideways, wounded captives gripping its rim while water poured over one edge. She set both feet among the roots and held it against the current until Lindor and Rumil dragged the bow into calmer water. "Take them north," she said. "Do not stop." The last horse crossed the failing ground. Galadriel followed as the strip behind her collapsed into the river. On the eastern bank, the pursuers reached the point opposite and found only open water between themselves and the moving company. Their archers gathered. Haldir saw them and called for shields. The rescued folk had none. The Galadrim formed a living wall along the eastern edge of the island, raising boughs, cloaks, and what few captured shields they had carried from the ruin. Arrows came through the dawn. One struck a warden in the thigh. Another passed through a cloak and grazed the old man who rode near the center. A third drove into the reeds beside a child's face. Galadriel stepped between the children and the eastern bank. Light gathered around her, clear and cold. It spread over the reeds, not as flame, but as a brightness like morning upon snow. The next flight entered it and lost its strength. Arrows dipped, struck water, or fell harmlessly among the roots. The enemy archers drew again. Galadriel raised her voice, and it carried across the channel. "You have followed far enough." The words rang beneath the trees. Men on the eastern bank hesitated, and some lowered their bows. The orcs among them recoiled and looked south, where the shadow of Dol Guldur still lay beyond the hills. Their fear had been driven westward by harsher wills. Yet before Galadriel's gaze that borrowed courage failed, then a deeper horn sounded from the woods behind them, and the hesitation ended. Fresh troops came out along the eastern bank, darker and better ordered than the ones who had chased them from the ruin. Close mail under black cloaks, Each man carried a long spear marked with a strip of white hide. At their center rode a figure beneath a hooded helm, mounted on a lean black horse. Haldir's face hardened. The hidden road! Galadriel had seen them in the broken vision beneath the prison, a force moving north under secret branches, led by one whose face was absent beneath the hood. They had come sooner than the guards of the captives expected, drawn by the horns and the fire. The hooded rider lifted one hand and the fleeing enemy steadied. Archers spread along the bank. Spearmen entered the shallows in ranks, testing the riverbed with their weapons. He did not urge them blindly into deep water. He had found the submerged stone ridge by watching where the broken shield line had fallen. Lindor said he could see the path. Galadriel answered that he saw where it had been. At the northern end of the island, Egnor appeared on the western bank, and behind him, wardens brought 2 narrow boats out of a hidden inlet, each low and swift upon the water, ropes stretched between their bows and the trees on the western shore. The captives saw them and quickened. The first boat crossed empty, drawn by a rope held from both banks. Rumil caught its bow among the reeds and began loading the weakest prisoners. The second came close behind. "Children first," Galadriel said, "then the wounded, and the horses last." The hooded rider entered the shallows. His black horse stepped where the hidden ridge had been, and the water reached only to its knees. Spearmen followed in 2 lines, shields raised against the arrows out of Lorien. Galadriel turned east. The rider's helm had no opening save a narrow darkness across the eyes, and beneath the hood no breath clouded the cold air. Yet she felt no wraith there, no ancient king bound to a ring. A lesser servant, wrapped in fear and craft, a man whose will had been hollowed out until only obedience was left. He drew a long blade. The water around his horse darkened. Galadriel lifted both hands. The island reeds shivered, and the current changed course, striking the eastern shallows from the north, pouring across the submerged ridge in one broad surge. The foremost spearmen lost their footing. Shields collided. The black horse reared, fighting water that climbed from its knees to its breast in moments. The hooded rider leaned forward and held. His blade came up, and a shadow spread from it over the river, pressing against Galadriel's light. The reeds nearest the eastern bank blackened at their tips. In the first boat, the children cried out as the rope tightened and began to draw them west. Galadriel stepped to the island's edge, and the brightness around her sharpened. For a heartbeat, the river between them was a field of white and black, the shadow from the sword reaching west, the light flowing east, the water rising beneath both. The Galadrim ceased shooting. No arrow could pass through that struggle. The hooded rider urged his horse forward. Galadriel opened her hand, and the black blade broke. Its upper half spun into the river, and the shadow collapsed with it. Light swept across the shallows. The rider's horse turned in terror, and spearmen were thrown aside as the animal fled for the bank. Haldir loosed. His arrow struck beneath the rider's arm, and Lindor's followed into the gap at the neck, and the hooded figure fell from the saddle and vanished beneath the churning water. The enemy line broke. "Cross!" Galadriel called. The first boat reached the western bank. Egnor lifted the children out and sent it back at once. The second carried wounded Galadrim and 3 prisoners who could no longer stand. Ropes hummed under the strain as wardens hauled from both shores. The eastern archers recovered and began to loose again. Galadriel's light had dimmed after the breaking of the black blade, and the arrows came through the reeds in greater number now. Haldir took one through the edge of his cloak. Rumil's captured shield split beneath 2 blows. Still the boats moved. Passage by passage the rescued folk crossed. The old man went west with the last of the children. The surviving horses entered behind the third crossing and swam beside the ropes, guided by Galadriel in the water. Fresh horns sounded south of the island. The wolfskin captain had found another path through the marsh and the field, and his riders appeared along the eastern bank behind the spearmen, fewer than before, horses lathered and bleeding. They had reached the river in time to see the last captives boarding. "Burn the boats!" he shouted, and men rushed forward with clay jars and pitch-soaked cords. Kalena drew his bow with blood seeping through the bandage at his shoulder. His first arrow broke a jar in its bearer's hands, and fire burst across the eastern reeds. His second struck another man in the chest. The third draw failed. His fingers opened and the bow slipped, and Galadriel caught it before it reached the water. She set one hand on his shoulder and guided him into the returning boat, telling him he had done enough. He said the island was not empty. She said it soon would be. Only Galadriel, Haldir, Rúmil, Lindor, and 6 wardens remained. The 2 boats came back together. Ropes stretched hard across the channel. Enemy fire was spreading along the eastern head of the island, driving smoke north through the reeds. Galadriel sent the wardens first. Rúmil began to protest. "Lady," and got no further than the word. "Go." He took the nearest boat with 3 others, and Lindor took the second. Haldir stayed beside Galadriel as both craft began their westward passage. The wolfskin captain came through the smoke and flame to the eastern edge of the island. He had left his horse behind and came on foot, sword in his uninjured hand, and behind him followed orcs with hooked poles meant to seize the ropes. Haldir raised his bow. Galadriel lowered it with one touch and said the ropes must remain whole. The orcs cast their hooks. Galadriel turned her gaze upon the burning reeds, and flame rose between them, sweeping across the island's eastern end in a bright wall, catching the hooked poles, forcing the orcs back. The wolfskin captain came through it regardless, one edge of his cloak burning, his face twisted with rage. He shouted that she could not carry them all away from him. Galadriel stood before the last boat as it came back empty through the smoke. "They were never yours." He rushed her, and Haldir met him first. Their blades struck once, twice, then locked. The man drove forward with the weight of anger and weariness behind him, and Haldir yielded half a step on the crumbling roots. Galadriel reached between the crossed blades and caught the captain's wrist. His strength failed. Haldir turned the sword and cast it into the river, and the man fell to his knees. Behind him, the fire had eaten away every road back to the eastern bank. Galadriel released him. The last roots broke beneath his weight, and he slid backward into the current, grasped once at the reeds, and was carried south beneath the smoke. The boat struck the island. Haldir got in first and took the stern rope. Galadriel stepped in after him, and the craft turned west as the wardens pulled from Lórien. Enemy arrows followed. They fell short, then nearer, striking the water around the boat. One lodged in the gunwale beside Galadriel's hand. Another cut through a strand of her hair and vanished into the river. She remained standing until the island was lost behind the smoke. The western bank came near. Grey-cloaked hands reached out of the shallows. The boat grounded on pale gravel, and Haldir stepped out. Galadriel followed him into the shelter of the golden wood. Behind them, Anduin ran bright beneath the rising sun, and the last enemy horns faded beyond the burning reeds. The western bank did not yet mean safety. Galadriel came up out of the shallows with river water streaming from her cloak, and found the rescued folk gathered beneath the first trees of Lórien. Wardens knelt beside the wounded. Children lay wrapped in grey mantles on beds of fern. The horses stood trembling among the roots, their flanks dark from the crossing. Past the sheltering branches, arrows still struck the gravel and skipped across the water. "Away from the bank," Galadriel said. "2 lines beneath the trees. Carry those who cannot rise." The Galadrim obeyed at once. Egnor sent half his company north and half south, spreading out beneath the willows against another crossing. Haldir took the rear of the rescued line, while Lindor and Rúmil lifted Kalinor between them. Nobody lingered to watch the enemy gather on the farther shore. Galadriel walked last from the river. She turned once beneath the willow branches. Across Anduin, the smoke drifted from the reed island, veiling the eastern bank in long grey folds, and behind it, dark figures moved, carrying wounded up from the shallows, hunting ground from which their bows might reach Lórien. Riders came south through the trees in broken groups. The force had lost its captains. Something else still pushed it on from beyond sight. The shadow had not let them go. A black shaft crossed the river and struck the willow trunk beside Galadriel. A strip of white hide was bound about its head, marked with the hooked tower. No mortal arm had range enough for that shot. It had gone up high into the morning wind and been carried by some craft that lingered east of the water. Haldir came back through the trees, having seen it. They had found a long bow, he said. "No bow sent this." Galadriel drew the shaft from the bark. The wood was warm. A faint stain moved under the surface, creeping toward her fingers like ink through water. She broke it once, and pale smoke hissed out of the splintered grain. "Keep every wounded man from the open sky," she told him. They were seeking one mark among many. Haldir asked, "Whose?" She looked toward the children being carried deeper into the wood. Theirs if they can find them. Mine if they cannot. A second shaft rose above the eastern trees. She saw it before it began to fall and lifted the broken arrow in her hand. The descending shaft turned in the wind, struck its twin above the river, and both burst apart in black dust that spread over the water and was gone. No third arrow came. The company moved west beneath the Malon. The rescued folk walked in silence at first, as though the golden wood were another vision that might fade if they spoke too loudly. Pale trunks rose around them. The high leaves caught the newborn sunlight and turned the road gold above their heads. Between the trunks, the darkness east of Anduin stayed visible, but with every step it narrowed. Galadriel passed along the line. She touched the shoulder of a wounded warden, and his breathing eased. She gave water to the woman who had shielded the children in the prison court. When the old man's grip weakened on the horse's mane, she put her hand over his and walked beside him, and said that he had carried the boy east. "As far as I could. You shall carry him no farther." The child rode ahead under Haldir's cloak, asleep against the breast of a Galadrim archer. The old man watched him through the trees, then bowed his head over the mane and went on. Behind them the river horns began again, faint now, but ordered. 3 notes from the eastern bank, one answering farther south. The broken pursuit had stopped. The enemy was gathering. Egnor came up through the trees from the rear, with word that they were bringing timber to the water. "Rafts," Haldir said. "Let them," Galadriel answered. They reached a long glade where the ground dipped beneath open sky. Morning light lay bright on silver grass, and a stream crossed their road from north to south. At its bank, the captives slowed, weary legs stiffening after the river. Galadriel stepped into the glade and felt the pressure from the east sharpen. The hidden will beyond Anduin had found their path. Birds went up from the far trees in one sudden cloud. A cold shadow crossed the grass with no cloud anywhere near the sun. The stream darkened. The horses lifted their heads. "Under the trees," Galadriel commanded. The rescued folk moved at once, but the glade was broad, and those at the center had not reached cover when a cry sounded high above. A great black bird came down from the east. It was larger than any crow, with wings broad enough to shadow 3 riders. Iron rings gleamed round its legs. Beneath its breast hung a clay vessel bound in wire, and a rider clung to a harness on its back, thin, hunched under a leather hood. Callana tried to lift his bow. Galadriel put one hand on it and told him to rest, and walked into the center of the glade. The creature folded its wings and fell toward her. Its rider drew a cord attached to the vessel, and a red spark showed beneath the clay. Galadriel raised her face. The malorn leaves around the glade shivered, and light poured down through them in 1,000 narrow beams, crossing above her like woven threads. The great bird struck that brightness and screamed. Its wings opened too late. The clay vessel tore free of the harness and went spinning down. Galadriel reached out. The vessel stopped above the grass. Fire flared inside it, red and hungry, pressing at the clay. She closed her hand. The vessel cracked inward with a sharp sound, and the flame vanished into a point of white light. The rider cut loose from the harness and fell toward the stream. He landed hard, rolled, and came up with a curved knife in each hand. Haldir moved from the trees. "Stay," Galadriel said. The rider ran at her with his head low, his face scarred under the hood with dark lines drawn from brow to jaw. He crossed half the glade before the silver grass rose around his legs. The blades tangled in the long stems. He cut once, but the grass wound higher, binding his wrists, dragging him to his knees, and Galadriel came to stand before him and asked who had sent him. He bared blackened teeth. "The hill sees." She asked who commanded the river. "The hill sees," he said again. She asked who waited upon the eastern road, and his eyes flicked toward Dol Guldur. That was answer enough. The great bird had fallen near the edge of the glade. It thrashed beneath the trees, tearing roots with its claws while 2 wardens kept beyond reach. Galadriel turned from the captive and went to it. Iron bands had been driven round its legs and breast, and the flesh beneath them was raw. A dark spike pierced the base of its neck, chained to the rider's harness. The bird snapped its beak at her. "Be still." The creature trembled. Its wings came down slowly into the grass. She laid one hand on the dark spike, and for a moment the glade filled with distant noise. Chains, commands, the beating of many wings in stone chambers beneath the eastern hill. Her face grew cold. She pulled the spike free. The bird convulsed once, then lay panting, black eyes fixed on her, the violence in them fading and leaving pain and bewilderment behind. She told them to cut the bands. Egnor came up with 2 wardens and said the thing had carried fire against them. It carried iron first. They broke the rings with small axes. When the last band fell, the great bird struggled upright. One wing dragged, but it could stand. Galadriel put her palm against its feathered brow and told it to go north and not return to the hill. The creature looked east. A shudder went through it. Her hand stayed steady. At last the bird spread its wings, ran across the grass, rose heavily above the stream, and turned north over the golden wood, black feathers drifting behind it in the morning light. The bound rider watched it go, and asked to be killed. Galadriel faced him and said he would be taken west and questioned. His jaw tightened. The hill would find him. The hill has already lost you. She left him under Egnor's guard and went back to the rescued line. They crossed the glade before the eastern horn sounded again. No shadow passed over them, and nothing more came from beyond Anduin. The road went into deeper malon groves, where platforms appeared among the branches, and Galadriel came down with food, water, and clean cloth. The captives were divided among them by need, the wounded going first toward the healers, families counted and joined. The 7 elves from beneath the prison walked together under the trees, each held up by a kinsman. Celeborn waited at the edge of Caras Galadon, standing beneath a high arch of golden branches, with no ceremony about him at all. His gaze went first to Galadriel, then past her to the rescued folk filling the road. She had found more than were taken last night, he said. 3 had waited long beneath the earth. He asked after the eastern force. Broken at the river, she told him. It would gather again. Celeborn looked toward Anduin, hidden now behind miles of trees, and said the borders would stand ready. They already do. Galadriel entered the city with the rescued company. Lamps still burned from the night, pale under the morning sun. Elves came down silently from the stairs and bridges with blankets and bowls of warm water. No song rose among the trees. The work of healing began at once. The child woke as Haldir lifted him down from the horse. He looked up at the golden boughs, then reached back for the old man who had carried him along the eastern road, and Galadriel brought the 2 of them together at the foot of the great stair. Far off, beyond the river and the darkening hills, a horn sounded out of Dol Guldur. The note reached the outermost trees of Lorien and went no farther. Galadriel stood under the malon leaves, with her cloak still wet from Anduin, and behind her, the gates of the Golden Wood closed on the last of the rescued captives. In Caras Galadon, the lamps were left burning into the morning, and the work of healing began with no song raised over it. Far to the east a horn sounded once out of Dol Guldur, and found no answer among the trees. The shadow had reached across the river for its prey, and drawn back a shorter arm than it believed it had.